So before we begin the final day of this event, we would like to take this opportunity to formally and wholeheartedly acknowledge the owners of the land that we are gathered on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our deepest respects to their elders, past and present, and those here today also. We pay our respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, queer folks, and activists who have given their hearts and their lives in their fight for justice. And also pay our respects to those Indigenous speakers who have been here with us throughout this weekend and want to acknowledge the emotional labour that it takes to participate in an event like that, and that is not lost on us. We keep in our minds and hearts the countless Indigenous lives that are lost and harmed by a system of racism and corruption that we are complicit in. We acknowledge the impact of colonisation on the current crisis of Aboriginal suicide rates and the white government policies that fail to address these. We keep in our hearts and minds names like Lynette Daly, Elijah Doherty, Wayne Fella Morrison, Miss Du, Dennis Doolan, and Dylan Voller. We also would encourage that everyone who's able to go to the next National Day of Action attend the rally that's happening in the CBD outside the State Library on October 22nd at 1 p.m. This is, always has been, and always will be Aboriginal land, and Aboriginal sovereignty has never been ceded. All right, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our final keynote all the way from New York. Please welcome Alok Vaid-Menon.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for making it here in the morning. I'm about to get really emotional and intense, but it's a Sunday morning, so we'll call it church. First and foremost, I want to begin by honoring the Aboriginal custodians and owners of this land. Gender is a colonial system, and there will be no trans liberation without Indigenous sovereignty. I also want to start by taking a moment to acknowledge and honor all of the trans and gender nonconforming people we have lost to murder and suicide this year, the majority of whom are trans feminine, Black, Indigenous, poor, and/or sex workers. Let us honor both the lives that we know and the countless numbers of people whose physical and spiritual deaths have gone unreported. Often trans and especially gender nonconforming people have to undergo two deaths, both the initial act of violence and the subsequent misgendering and erasure in death. Thank you for all that you were and for all that you continue to give us today. It is the summer of 2015, and I am in Chicago celebrating my father's 60th birthday. One of the most joyous parts about growing up as a queer Indian is that I've come to hold a very deep and sincere appreciation for paradox and simultaneity. A relative telling you that they love you but hurting you instead. A joy, a fear in the same breath. On the plane to Chicago, I am dreading seeing family, or rather being seen by family, or rather dreading their probing questions, their disapproving glances, their relentless skepticism of my life and my job and me. On the other hand, I am overwhelmed with a deep and resonant sense of adoration, or rather, dreaming of the food, the humor, the kind of unconditional love I don't know how to translate into English yet. The act of getting dressed to see family is already always political, so for this one trip, I opt for that ambiguous space. Short shorts, blouses with plunging V-necks, but no skirts or dresses. After cutting the cake, my aunt tells me that she recently stumbled on some YouTube videos of me performing, and she quite enjoyed them. I am surprised by this move. Denial is usually our favorite choice of seasoning. I understand this as her way of acknowledging my difference. My cousin chimes in, yes, your performance seems so realistic, so raw, so authentic. It's almost as if you're speaking about your own life. And your and your costumes, they are so cool. And then I get it. My family understands performance as when you dress up as something that you are not and tell a story that is not yours. My family understands transgender as when you dress up as something that you are not and tell a story that is not yours. I think a large degree of the acceptance I've achieved for my family and my people as a whole has come because they think that this is my art practice and not who I am. I turn to performance as a way to communicate my complexity, my rage, my joy, my entirety, but gender gets often in the way of me actually being seen. What does my family see when they see me? How come that image is more powerful than anything that I'm saying? What are they projecting onto me? What ideas and narratives about performance, identity, and life itself are being graphed onto my body? In that moment, I want to write 5 Facebook statuses about the brown knowledge systems of my elders. Talk about how they all have different ways of understanding gender that are real and valid and transformative. I want to believe that my family is subversive or resisting something or doing something relevant and maybe even radical. On the other hand, I want to write 3 poems about familial transphobia and how it destroys me and how we don't yet have a language for that type of intimate violence, of being erased by your own people, even though your gender is your fiercest devotion to them, that kind of time travel that comes from being told you are new, even though you know that inside you are very, very old. And at the time, I felt small in an incredibly large and terrifying world where I don't have the language or the geographic coordinates to say something as bold and rebellious as, this is who I am, this is what my gender is. I feel lost and unable to figure out how to respond, stupid for saying, no, my gender is not a performance, it is real, because why should I have to make claims to authenticity to be whole? Don't want to blame my family for not understanding me, want to blame myself for not understanding them, and it hurts having to hold so much. Your anxiety, other people's anxiety, your audience's anxiety, and at some point you can't tell the difference between their fear and your body, their confusion and your own. I don't really know anything. I am not brave or smart or powerful or resilient. I am lost and hurt, and the things that I write about are often the things I need to articulate to justify being alive. I want to figure out what my family sees in me, know what they see in themselves when they see videos and photographs of me. I want to figure out why performance was one of the only spaces in my life I was given permission to experiment with my gender. I want to figure out what it would take to celebrate gender nonconforming people of color, and especially those of us who are trans feminine, outside of the context of a photograph, a video, or a stage. To begin, I hold these truths as self-evident. 1, there is no such thing as a transgender issue. There are just issues that cisgender people have with us. The task then is not to empower trans people, but rather to disempower those who turn their insecurity into an insurgency against us. There are currently no funding streams dedicated to supporting the cisgender community and overcoming their backwards ideologies. I fully intend to change that. 2, complimenting gender nonconforming people for our beauty and our resilience does not stop the violence we experience. Rather, it can be a tactic to A, recuse yourself of responsibility in perpetuating our suffering, or B, overcompensate for the fact that you are surprised because deep down you still believe that gender nonconformity is tragic and ugly. I tried to tell my last street harasser that a lot of people thought I was a brave and beautiful soul, but that did not stop him from following me home and making threats to my life. 3, I have never met a man or a woman in my life. I have met thousands of extraordinarily complicated people who are drowning in the categories they've been submerged into without their consent. Instead of asking for help, they are determined to bring us down with them. One time on the subway, a person came up to me and whispered that they wore dresses at home but never outside. I wondered if that moment, if all of the men who harassed me in public were really men in private. 4, gender nonconforming people are not failing to be men or women. We are, in fact, succeeding at freeing ourselves from a world that requires conformity for humanity. The reason we are punished is not because we are different, but rather because people recognize a part of themselves in us that they had to destroy in order to survive. It is hard to have your abundance mistaken as absence. 5, trans people should not have to be gender conforming to be safe. Trans people should not have to be gender conforming to be desirable. People of color should not have to be gender conforming to be respected. The fact that we do suggests not only how much work we have ahead of us, but how much was taken from us. They tell us that our narratives need to be digestible, but I wonder which parts of our left after we are finished being consumed. 6, the stage is simultaneously a site of transcendence and torture for us. On the one hand, we relish in the ability to express ourselves on a stage, but on the other, we know that we are only permitted to exist in a photograph, on a stage, in an exhibition. Our gender is already always understood as a costume, something staged and never real. Is a photograph allowed to have a heartbeat? Is a photograph allowed to breathe? What happens when the photograph walks out of the frame and onto the street? Does it survive? Do you care? 7, the only thing trans people come out of is the gender binary that was imposed on us. We are not born in the wrong body, we were born in your wrong world. Asking for gender is another way of asking, where did you come from? Sometimes when I answer, water comes out. 8, I have never felt more authentic in my life than when I was performing on a stage. Could it be that white supremacy has so thoroughly consecrated and ritualized lying, call it school or medicine or government or God, that these moments when we are encouraged to perform are actually the only moments we are permitted to become real? I came out on the stage wearing a dress and I left with it still on. Why did the applause turn into outrage when I walked off the stage and onto the street? I began with these disclaimers because I want us to think today about the limitations of an image. Before I began this speech, my image was already doing the talking. Why is he, I mean why is she, I mean why is they wearing a dress? Why am I so uncomfortable by seeing a man in women's clothing? Oh crap, I don't think that they're actually a man in women's clothing. I have never seen anyone who looks like them speaking. How are they so confident to leave the house like that? Oh crap, it shouldn't require confidence to be who you are. This interaction, this host of assumptions and reactions to my image, even before I started speaking, is what I want to explore together. There's a saying we hear all over the place, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And every time someone says it, I want to groan and say, yes, but will you stay all afternoon and actually listen to those 1,000 words? Because the truth is, a lot of them are very, very mean. A lot of them should make you upset. Some of them should make you wish there was an IRL comment section that you could chime in and say, excuse me, comment number 47, that was incredibly problematic. But we don't really do that. We take photographs, and especially photographs of marginalized people, as a stand-in for who they are, some intrinsic essence that magically and fantastically exudes from the image. I don't buy it. I believe in captions. On a given day in New York City, I am walking around, let's say, drinking juice, going to the museum, meeting up with a friend for dinner, and on the way, at least a dozen people will take out their cell phones to take photos and videos of me without my consent. I have developed several strategies to deal with this encounter. At least you could have told me you're photographing me today. I would have dressed up for the occasion. Oh wait, I did. Or, let me at least strike a pose. But on my less patient days, I just sort of hunker down, look at my own cellular device, and try to hobble over to where I'm going as fast as possible, which can be difficult in 5-inch heels, I assure you. What I really want to do is have like a printed receipt with a caption that reads something like, hello, you forgot to ask me for my name. It's Alok, in case you were wondering, and I'm a non-binary person, which means I don't know who I am and I'm not sure if I ever will. But I can tell you for sure I'm not a boy or a girl, which is not really that big of a deal. The reason you are taking my photo is because you are reducing me to a spectacle and an object instead of granting me my full humanity. By the way, you do not own me or my representation. I'm a person. I have feelings, and that hurt. You will forget me, but I will never forget you. But then I remember that women's clothing doesn't really have pockets because of sexism, so thank you. I would have nowhere to keep these receipts, and then I remember that if I dare speak back in this way, there would be serious repercussions, which goes to say, I believe in captions when they are possible. I think images are important, but I am deeply concerned about the relationship between image and trans people. Would trans people even exist if you didn't want to take our photographs? I am concerned by what it means to be a trans performer in a world where people already think that who I am is already a performance itself. I am concerned by how we keep on calling cisgender people looking at us progress, when that is what they have been doing to us since the beginning of time. I am concerned by how we keep on calling cisgender people clapping for trans people on a stage groundbreaking, when they continue to use those hands to slap and abuse us behind closed doors. I am concerned by how we keep on calling trans visibility inspirational, when trans visibility is actually an oxymoron. It is impossible to look trans because our genders are who we are, not necessarily what we look like. I am concerned with how we keep on conflating recognition with visibility. Certainly, there are other forms of recognition beyond what we look like, especially in a political climate where so many trans and especially gender nonconforming people like me have to choose safety over authenticity. And most of all, I am concerned with a thorough and systematic erasure of gender nonconforming trans feminine people from the gay movement, from the feminist movement, and for now, the trans movement. How this alleged trans tipping point has not yet come to embrace those of us who identify and present outside of the white colonial gender binary. How acceptance of trans people still is determined by how much we approximate and uphold cisgender, heterosexual, and white norms. How what little progress trans people have had in the media and entertainment landscape has largely been through distancing ourselves from our gender nonconformity and making appeals to cisgender fantasies of what trans people should look and act like, failed gender deviants who can only be fixed and integrated into white, heterosexual, cisgender womanhood. In this talk, I want to argue that representation of trans people in the entertainment world, and especially gender nonconforming people like me, is insufficient. We deserve more. Yes, images are cute. They have been fundamental in my own journey of self-discovery and exploration, but I don't think we are just fighting to be represented. I think we are fighting for something deeper and perhaps even more spiritual than that. We are in a political moment where trans visibility is on the rise, but what about trans subjectivity? I do not believe that visibility directly translates into subjectivity. The difference between visibility and subjectivity is the difference between being objectified and being respected, is the difference between a meme-ment and a movement. I believe we have a trans meme-ment, not a movement. A meme is a humorous image, video, piece of text that is copied and spread rapidly as a means of entertainment. The subject of the meme is permitted no life, let alone consent, outside of the image, as its only purpose is to entertain other people. The image then becomes a trap, one that promises mass exposure but actually relies on mass erasure. The meme is concerned more with virality than vitality, parody than profundity, consumability than complexity. Despite widespread visibility, the meme is still fundamentally regarded as a joke. The meme is still defined by the dominant culture. The meme has no ability to shift the culture itself. The meme is simultaneously something you can identify with online, but would never offline. What thinking through this trans moment as a meme-ment allows me to do is reconsider this moment of trans visibility as actually a moment of cisgender fantasy. To be more blunt, I believe that the current project of trans visibility is more about cisgender people creating and strengthening their own cisgender and white identities than it is about trans people uplifting our own. It is about my family believing my gender is a performance in order to believe that theirs is real. Trans visibility, TM, creates a type of universal transness that is separated from our actual lives, interests, and ways of being. It grossly oversimplifies us and reduces us to our aesthetics and our genitalia instead of regarding our full and total subjectivity. Newsflash, trans people don't just live trans lives. We are extraordinarily textured, diverse, and complex, just like you. Trans people should not have to be visible to be real. Trans people should not have to be visible to be regarded as human. There's not one trans story, trans body, trans aesthetic. We just aren't permitted that complexity because white supremacy is invested in reducing us to our genitalia and our bodies. White supremacy has taught the world that trans femininity is superficial, not substantive. That trans femininity is apolitical, not powerful, taught the world that trans femininity can only belong on the stage and never on the streets. And those of us who are trans women and trans feminine people of color have to grapple with the theft of our aesthetics and our livelihoods to be only repurposed for an agenda that we never consented to, have to be reduced continually and thoroughly to parodies of white cisgender women and not something meaningful, wonderful unto ourselves. And last time I checked, I'm not interested in being a white cis woman, they're interested in being me. I am I am more interested in what it would mean, what it would take, what it would look like for people to embrace gender nonconforming people beyond our visibility, a profoundly anti-racist move, I believe, what it would mean to actually regard what we are saying, what we are doing, our intelligence, our artistry, our power. It's not enough to be invited to the table if we're going to be misgendered when we get there. It's not enough to be invited to the table if the very ways we have to identify ourselves, narrate our experiences, and live our lives is defined by white cisgender norms. Ask yourself, why aren't trans people invited to take portraits of cisgender people and interview them about their genders? Why aren't cisgender people hosting cisgender monologue series? Why don't cisgender artists include their gender in their bios and their promotional materials? Why am I required to be a trans artist and not just an artist? This is where I see the creative work of gender nonconforming people as a necessary intervention. I'm part of a generation of gender nonconforming artists, thinkers, and activists who are navigating an unfamiliar landscape of simultaneous hypervisibility and yet still hyper-erasure, trying our best to find language and give image to ourselves and meaning to ourselves in a world that thinks it knows us but didn't even ask for permission first. Many of us turn to art as a place to assert ourselves outside of your stories. The difference between a photo that stands alone and a photo that speaks back to you, that is invited to present a lecture, is a question of subjectivity and therefore a question of humanity. I like photos. I think I look cute in them sometimes, but I also like conversations. I also like poetry. My work uses image as well as poetry because I want to push us not just to settle for the mass consumption of our aesthetics and actually push farther and demand trans justice. That we argue not just for the legitimacy of being trans or gender nonconforming, but that we argue for the legitimacy of being whole, and that, my friends, is an entirely different project. Right now in my art practice, I've been thinking about what it means to carry a controversial body. I say carry as if my body is not mine because what I've realized is that gender was something that was forced on me. It's not something I chose. The problem wasn't that I was misgendered. The problem was that I was gendered to begin with. Assigned male at birth doesn't quite capture how I am still assigned male every single day on the street, at the school, at the airport, almost everywhere I go. The language of gender identity feels like it misses the point. What about those of us who don't identify with gender to begin with anyways? How can we have an identity based off of our lack of gender? Why are we defined by our absence and not our abundance? The reason my body is considered controversial is not because I necessarily wanted it to be, but rather because other people made it so, because various trajectories of colonialism and white supremacy have made it so that gender nonconforming people are not allowed to exist in public. We are only permitted space in a performance context. I wake up and brush my teeth and get dressed and walk down the street like everyone else. Okay, maybe not everyone does that, but that's fine. And bam, gender. I realize that I'm controversial when everyone stares and points at me, laughs at me, taunts me, and pushes me down. It's really kind of awkward how white cisgender people blame us for making everything about gender when they are the ones who invested in it to begin with anyways. Last time I checked, it was white cisgender people who insisted on putting a gender on my birth certificate, who insisted on putting a gender in my identity documents, who defined their entire sexual and romantic preferences, lifestyles, and orientations on the basis of gender, but I digress. It is that interaction that I've been so fascinated about exploring in my art practice. As a class-privileged gender nonconforming person, most of my interactions are with other people and not necessarily the state. For many working-class gender nonconforming people, gender nonconformity means murder, means criminalization, means being fired from jobs, means being denied access to domestic violence shelters and homeless shelters, means being refused health care, means police brutality and murder, means being tortured in prisons. According to the National Center for Trans Equality in my country, non-binary people are actually the most likely to experience physical and sexual harassment. These interactions are not just about theory, they are about life or death for many people in my community. I have the privilege to get away from violent interactions in a taxi, whereas many do not. What do people do when they are confronted with an image that they have no frame of reference for? How do they react? What memories, emotions, and ideas and histories does the image produce? What does that interaction say about our society and what it's come to hold about difference and what is gender anyways? It's fascinating to bear witness to the mental gymnastics that cisgender people have to undergo to understand something so simple as, and what it reveals to me is that gender is not actually about gender. It's about a whole host of other and perhaps more universal trauma, desire, and repression. I want us to move away from our reliance on gender identity, which already always puts the burden on individual trans people to do the labor of proving ourselves using language that wasn't made for us, to instead regarding gender as a relational system. This shift, I believe, is incredibly important because as it currently works, trans people are tasked with the task of liberating ourselves from the fantasies and anxieties of cisgender people, rather than cisgender people being tasked with the actuality of confronting your own inadequacy and insecurities. My gender is a series of fairy tales that other people made up about me. It's my body and its image being filtered through a series of colonial tropes like the man in a dress, here to instill moral and sexual panic, the racialized person who needs to be civilized into Western Christian gender norms. No thank you, I'll pass. The flip of the script becomes, what does my gender, or rather, what does your anxiety about my gender say about you? I should say here that part of my coping strategy for the constant scrutiny I have to endure every single day of my life for simply existing is that I've learned to intellectualize what were and continue to be a series of incredibly violent interactions. The reality of being a gender nonconforming person is that there is no respite or break from the constant harassment, scrutiny, and policing of every realm and dimension of our lives. Those of us who do not transition into safety, disappear ourselves into white cisgender norms, are constantly viewed as failed men or women and are victim blamed for all of the violence that we experience. Why did he/she/it have to be so visible? Why couldn't he/she/it try to fit in more? Why can't he/she/it just done that at home? Working through these interactions through art has given me a space for at least a few moments in my life to be allowed to be outside of my body. And I just want to take a moment to mourn that, how so many gender nonconforming people literally have to divorce ourselves from our bodies in order to survive. How dysphoria then is not some sort of psychological condition that we have, but rather something that is imposed and policed on us due to the constant regulation and commentary on every realm of our lives. But the medical establishment won't tell you that, because this is how sinister things are. The very people who produce the conditions that assault every fabric of our existence are then the people who pathologize us for our natural responses of hurt, loneliness, and indignation, and then profit off of that, get called experts. There's so many questions that I have for the people who harass me. I want to take them out for hot chocolate, talk to them about their childhood trauma, ask them about the desires they might have been taught to repress, but unfortunately, due to a combination of both my fear and their hostility, I try to get away from the situation as soon as possible. The internet becomes one of the only places where I can really tease out, sit with, and explore this interaction. My body, their gaze. The internet has given me a platform to explore what people are thinking about when they see my image and what comes up for them. For better, okay, mostly for worse, people feel less inhibited with reactions on the internet. It gives them an opportunity to embody a self, an expression, a response that they may not give in public. When I post photos of myself, what I'm trying to do is simulate a world where I could hand people that caption on the street, make people understand that gender nonconforming people are living, breathing, fucking free people. The majority of the comments I receive are often supportive and kind. Often they help give me the stamina and strength to keep going, and I'm grateful for that. But of course, I find myself more fascinated by the negative comments. They give me a language, a framework to begin to understand what it is about gender nonconformity that so fundamentally unsettles people, many of whom call themselves feminists. They help me understand the crisis the cisgender community is going through, and it's a really drastic crisis. How they have lost their spiritual center and rely on putting down us to remember that they actually have a voice. What I want to do now is review with you some of the comments I've received on my photos online. I selected some of the more, well, let's just say, colorful examples to help express the meme mint we are in now. I want to thank these strangers for their honesty, for having the audacity to express what they actually think. It actually gives me something to work with. Is that not a dude? Hairy legs, flat chest, facial hair. I'm fine with whatever it/they/them wants to call it they themselves, but it they them might find it beneficial toward the aim of being the opposite gender. So that really actually doesn't make sense, that last part of the sentence. So that was like my first reaction. I was like, I think that there's also like a literacy, I don't know. So one of the first things that we noticed, right, is that those of us who refuse to participate in gender literally get called it. And what I love about that is you're acknowledging that in order to be regarded as a subject or a human in this world, you have to be consensually, you have to participate in gender. And that those of us who actually are not interested in doing that because we have bigger priorities in our lives and better outfits to wear, actually literally get reduced to the status of an object. So therefore, when we experience violence, we're not experiencing violence that can be understood as a human right? We're being understood violence that can only be understood by throwing a piece of trash in a trash can. We literally become an object, so therefore we're not allowed to have emotional complexity. Then we're constantly reduced to our bodies, hairy legs, flat chest, facial hair. That's a lot of pressure for cisgender women if they have to not have hairy legs, if they have to have size D tits, and if they grow 1 inch or one tiny mustache, then that disqualifies them from their entire womanhood. But what we see continually is that gender is conflated with our bodies, and what we lose there is that it was only until colonial contact that gender became defined as an embodied practice with absence of genitalia or not. Prior to that, in indigenous traditions across time, and still today, gender was understood more as a social role in our communities versus what we looked like physically. And then once again, gender in this statement is understood as something that I call myself, not who I am. And this way, cisgender people position us as just a costume or a parody or a prop. The continual goal becomes me wanting to have the aim of being the opposite gender, not trying to liberate myself from gender itself. Next comment. Holy shit, you look like a poor drag queen just got hit by a garbage truck. Drag queen, as if I'm trying to emulate something that I'm not. The truth is, I think it's actually deeply problematic that trans people have to distance ourselves from drag, because I think for many of us, drag, and especially as people of color, is one of the only spaces that we're given permission to actually explore ourselves. And I actually have a lot of fun getting in drag as well, and I don't see that that disqualifies my femininity. But I think what I really loved about this statement, thank you so much, anonymous commenter, is that what you're essentially saying is that those of us who are not interested in pursuing medical transition are actually disposable, actually getting hit by a garbage truck. You can't kind of make that more explicit, right? So that we've created this new paradigm now where we're actually increasing violence against gender nonconforming people, because now not only are we failing to be cisgender, we are failing to be transgender, because the only model you have of transition are people who are interested in assimilating into white cisgender womanhood and medicalizing their transition. And that though the rest of us, essentially, how dare we exist in the street as visibly gender nonconforming, and what the assumption there is to exist on the street as a gender nonconforming trans feminine person is to be murdered, right? Like that's literally the only insinuation there, that we have no frame of reference for a gender nonconforming person who is not experiencing violence. And what I realized in my life is that I had no frame of reference to understand my gender outside of people calling me a faggot, a tranny, a terrorist, a bitch, a piece of shit, a piece of trash, someone who deserves to be raped, killed, or burned. The next comment. Sorry, but not. I'd beat your ass if you came up on me. So this was just commented on, just a photo of me, just standing on the street. And some man, I think, I don't want to assume his gender, commented, sorry but not, I would just beat your ass if you came up on me. So what this actually shows is that trans people, and especially those of us who are trans feminine, actually only belong to cisgender men's nightmares and fantasies interchangeably. That our genders actually don't belong to us, they are only understood as sexual perversions, always oriented around desire for cisgender men, and that actually our very existence is an invitation to be raped, and that our very existence basically creates a victim-blaming logic where we can actually not have consent, because by actually presenting as gender nonconforming, we've consented to already being a threat to everyone. And this is what reoccurringly happens when we experience gender and sexual-based violence. We get blamed for it because the expectation there becomes that the only reason that we're presenting as gender nonconforming in public is because we want to signify that we're actually queer and interested in sleeping with men on the street, not that we can have our own relationship and ownership of our femininity. But I think it's very interesting that cisgender feminism will stop at its analysis of street harassment to say cisgender women should not be raped for wearing dresses, but not talk about how even without a dress, gender nonconforming people are already structurally seen as asking for it. Next comment. Glad you are happy regardless of who you are. Thumbs up. The outfit is badly matched. Stripes with stripes. Perhaps that is why people harass you. Ask some of your female friends to help with your selections. P.S. Love the boots. Have a blessed day. So I really love this one because this is one that we don't often talk about. The current in vogue moment in trans discourse is that we, as the tragic trans subject, have to thank cisgender women so much for inviting us to the table that we actually built for them. I'm not interested in being a part of your feminism, actually, because your feminism has always relied on a colonial equation that womanhood is only linked to your vaginas and to your reproductive faculty, whereas my feminism has understood that femininity is under attack in a misogynist world where any expression of an intelligence, of an artistry, of a creativity that centers femininity is devalued, disposed, and criminalized. So what's interesting to me in this moment is that an alleged cisgender woman who is like caring about me for some reason thinks that the reason that I get attacked is because I don't know how to match my clothing, which I think is actually might be easy to dismiss, but I want you to understand here that what essentially she's doing is you are failing to look like a white, pretty cis girl, so therefore you deserve to be attacked. And what she's also saying is your white cis female saviors can help you dress appropriately so that you can actually stop being attacked, right? So what she's actually trying to really allow, I mean, thank you so much, what she's really trying to show us is that the only possibility of trans existence is that we need to emulate the aesthetics, the politics, and the identity of white cisgender women, which I think is so dehistoricized because actually white cis women's entire conception of their femininity and their feminism came from us. The truth is the only reason that femininity was worth something fighting for, let alone making aesthetic out of it, was because we had to fight like hell from it from the minute that we were born. You decided to become feminist. I couldn't tell the difference between saying I was not a man and being a feminist, that actually my body was my first site of protest and I've been rioting ever since, and that actually every single day I walk out on the street I'm already marching. That's why I did not attend your slut walk rally. I was already marching. Next comment. It's amazing that the new feminism is quite literally a man in a dress telling women he suffers more than they do. You folks are a parody. 6 likes. Let's say that one again. It's amazing that the new feminism is quite literally a man in a dress telling women he suffers more than they do. You folks are a parody. 6 likes. Why, thank you so much. Yes, the new feminism is actually a man in a dress telling women that he suffers more than they do. Thank you. And the truth is, what we reoccurringly see is this fear and anxiety around this object of the man in the dress, right? And so as trans people, we are asked constantly to perform a type of respectability politics where we say, I'm not a man in a dress, I'm not a drag queen, I'm not a gay man, as in, save me because I'm just a cisgender woman, as if the only way that we can get respect and safety is by making claims to the innocence of white cisgender women. Why is that, Alok? Let's take a little history lesson. When settler colonialism began to expand across the world through the British Empire, one of the first things that initial colonists wrote about upon their point of contact was, why are these men wearing dresses? What they did is look at the indigenous gender systems of people who were outside of a backwards Western colonial Christian framework and demonize them as terrorists, essentially, for doing something as basic as practicing a culturally specific way of adorning and creating in community. Often the first people who experienced settler violence were trans feminine gender nonconforming people, or what we would call them now, right? And that it was not just a motivation of gender, but a motivation of wanting to civilize people into the modern gender binary, right? Because what colonization was and continues to be is the forced assimilation of indigenous people, black people, people of color, migrant people, into white gender and Christian norms, right? So when this person is saying the new feminism, it's really interesting because it creates this timeline arc where actually what was very much the old feminism, what was very much what indigenous people were practicing as a way to unsettle a type of heteropatriarchy, now is considered new. That's really wrong. And then tells that he suffers more than they do. Actually, I'm here to let you know, cisgender women, a lot of men in dresses do suffer more than you do, and you need to grapple with that. That actually, you actually have privilege on the basis of your femininity and your desirability by a heteropatriarchal state. That actually street harassment for many of us as gender nonconforming people does not look like, hey sexy or hey mommy. Not that those are things that I'm interested in, because I understand that they're still rooted in sexism, but I want to let you know that I've never had anyone in my life hit on me on the street. I've only had people tell me that I should die, that I should burn in hell, that I should rot, that I'm disgusting, that I deserve to be killed, that I should be raped. I've never had anyone say you look beautiful. So when cisgender women complain about being called beautiful on the street, I want to remind you that there's a difference between desire and disgust, and a lot of it has to do with life and death. So what I want to also get to a point of talking about femininity is, it's not that white cisgender women have structural gender power. What I'm trying to get at is white cisgender women have a place within a gender colonial system that trans feminine people of color like me never will, unless we emulate the dominant values. So those are some comments. Thanks for the comments. And so It gets exhausting to continually have to argue for the legitimacy of your existence. How are you supposed to be recognized for your ideas when they don't even believe you about your body? It gets exhausting when the only reason that you're invited in the room is to be stared at. It gets lonely when you're always the only one. So eventually the impulse becomes to make a plea for accommodation. Accept me, recognize me, love me, make me visible. And this is where I hesitate. I hesitate because it seems like we're in a moment where we insist that visibility is the same thing as justice. But why should we have to make ourselves visible to the very people who oppress us to begin with anyways? Whose standards of visibility must we emulate? Why should we have to prove who we already were? The truth is, I am not actually gender nonconforming. You only see me as such because you're filtering my experiences through the white colonial gender binary. Gender nonconformity and transness itself is a fiction created by white cisgender culture to recreate itself. This is what we are not. You harassing us becomes a way of performing the fact of who you are. Media helps uphold this myth that gender is real. The truth is, we deserve a movement, not a meme-ment. I am not a man or a woman. The truth is, I don't have a gender. The truth is, I shouldn't have had to wear women's clothing, put on makeup, change my pronouns in order for you to believe and respect the violence that I experience. The truth is, I shouldn't have to take a photograph for you to see me. The truth is, none of us should have to change who we are in order to be believed. The truth is, I shouldn't have to tell my family that my gender is not a performance. So what if it is? That doesn't make me any less real than you. Why should we have to destroy the darkest, the most feminine, the most sensitive parts of ourselves in order to be taken seriously? Why must we have to look like white cisgender people in order to be believed? Why should I have to change the way I look in order to exist? Why should I have to make you feel comfortable about my appearance to ensure that you do not attack me? Gender is not what we look like, it is who we are. You are not what you look like, you are who you are. We are far too vast and incredible to be reduced to our bodies and our appearances. I get it. I want so badly to be recognized. My entire life I've grown up feeling erased, but visibility is a double-edged sword. I shouldn't have to compromise myself, apologize for my existence, in order to receive something so simple as acknowledgement. I shouldn't have to put myself at risk of daily violence for something so basic as recognition. You tell trans people to be visible, but you do not protect or fight for us when we make ourselves visible to you. The days when I am most visible are the days I fear for my life the most. We try so hard to be seen, but when we are, it is only the parts of us that are palatable that are regarded. They put us up as props next to their portraits. The difference between a prop and a portrait is a matter of subjectivity. We are still objects that they collect like trophies to include in their view books and their marketing, but never in their compassion, their intellect, their paradigm. Coherence requires compromise. Compromise requires assimilation. Assimilation requires erasure. Erasure requires no longer being able to tell the difference between who you are and who they say that you should be. People often ask me how I came to be an artist. They expect me to tell them about some formal training, but the truth is, growing up in this world as a gender nonconforming person means that you have to have a certain degree of artistry to survive. You have to find a way to fashion a self out of nothing. You have to be creative and adaptable with words and symbols that were never meant for you. But what I learned is that it is that the impossibility of it all that inspires me to keep going. It's the recognition of the futility, the constant and persistent failure, the inability to articulate the depths of what you feel inside that keeps you going. Being trans, and especially being gender nonconforming, has given me the space to reconsider what this world calls nothing, what this world calls failure. It's not that I failed to be a man or a woman, it's that these words and binaries were never meant for us. It's not that I failed to capture the intangible, it's that the intangible was never meant to be captured. One of the many perks of being gender nonconforming is that I get to spend a lot of my time thinking about questions of recognition and worth. My entire life I've been made to feel like a pariah, watching all the rituals of society always from a distance. And what I've come to realize is that actually everyone is constantly negotiating a desire for recognition. It seems that all of us are out here conflating recognition with meaning, as if someone else has the power to determine our worth, as if we mean nothing until we are seen. And one of the perks of never truly being seen as you are is you have to sit a moment with your invisibility, relish in the nothingness, and it is in the space of absence that I've come to appreciate alternative economies of worth, of meaning, of purpose. Selfies, and self-portraits more generally, have become instrumental to my art practice because I find that they're some of the only space in a visual and entertainment landscape for self-authorship, for self-birth. When taking a selfie, selfie, I can resist the meme. Selfies have been helpful to document my transition, not the before and after, pre and post transition photos that cis culture so desperately clings to prove the legitimacy of their medical gender binary, but rather the continual and nonlinear journey of trying to figure out who the hell I am more generally. I wanted to close just by reading one or two of my poems about the subjects that I was bringing up today, because the point I'm trying to make is that looking at a photo of me, or watching me perform, or watching me give a speech, doesn't actually unsettle the fact that you only understand this as possible because I am in front of a microphone right now. What my poetry attempts to do is to create an imagination where you can actually not have to see my body to believe me, where I don't actually have to see videos and footage of me getting attacked for you to believe me. Every poem I write is an earnest and sincere commitment to a potential for people to actually understand that we should believe the fuck out of people who are hurting and not require them to look and adhere to values in order to be believed. So I wrote this caption. I took a really great selfie. I would show you if I could, but I don't want to. And I wrote this caption. I took this selfie before leaving the house today. This is before a man right outside my door looked at me and said, "What the fuck is that?" His friends began to follow and record me until I couldn't take it, so I got into a taxi. In the car, I looked at the selfie of me, and I remember how powerful I felt when I took it. I remember how fun it was to get ready. I remember the delight of seeing my chest hair and my lipstick and my floral all together. Most of all, I remember feeling safe, feeling at peace. I've been thinking a lot recently about what selfies mean to me and why I'm so moved by them. Today, I remember in the car that what selfies allow me to do is to remember who I am, what I am fighting for, and what the world I want to create looks like. A selfie is an earnest invitation to the world I am making for myself. WTF is the #1 reaction I get leaving my house, and I feel like I'm finally coming up with an answer. What you see is someone just trying to figure it out, someone desperately trying to remember what it means to prioritize my joy over your fear. What you see is someone trying my best to find meaning in a world that continually thinks that it knows what's best for me. What you see is someone who is equally confident and equally terrified, as someone who needs your help to get free. When the 17th person takes a photo of me without my consent, I begin to wonder if I have a body anymore. A recognition that at some point, so many hands and eyes consume me that there was simply nothing left for myself. This is what happens when the private parts become public domain, and I say "the" instead of "my" because I looked in between my legs and saw a chat forum happening there. I tried to chime in but got blocked. How naive it would be to believe I could own something that others hold on to so dearly. The other day, my doctor asked me to breathe, and I tried, but I forgot how. There was simply no frame of reference. All of the images I remember of myself involved me doing everything but breathing. There's no animated GIF for that. There are hundreds of photos of me circulating in text threads and web forums across the world. Look at the souvenir I saw in New York. Look at this thing today I saw at the mall. #me, #same, #myBF, #WTF, #goals. What I've learned is that it is only socially permissible to identify with me online. There's a type of loneliness that comes from everyone staring at you but no one seeing you. Every time someone takes a photo of me, I want to give them a hug to remind them that I am real. But the moment a meme becomes a person, the screen cracks and there is violence. Body. I've come to the conclusion then that the only place I'm allowed to exist is a photograph. Exhibit A costume for a play. Exhibit B, how inspirational. Read, I would never. A transgressive model breaking down gender norms. Exhibit C, an art installation. Exhibit D, a social media darling who inspires you to only like the photo, not stop the violence. Exhibit E, share this, LMAO. A monkey wears a dress and calls himself a woman. Exhibit me to prohibit me. Thank you. So I think we still have some time for Q&A. Let's clap for this person, yeah. I don't know who you were. Thanks.
Actually, first, I just want to wait a little bit more and give preference to any Indigenous or queer people of colour in the room. We've still got time, so people can think. Okay. Thank you so much, Alok. How do you speak with such fluidity? Do you rehearse what you speak for hours and hours? How do you do this?
No, I don't rehearse. Everything I write is my first draft. And the reason I do that is because I started writing when I was 13 years old, and I was an emo kid, which meant that I listened to like bands like Something Corporate or like Dashboard Confessional and Bright Eyes, which I still love. And I would just sob in my room and write down what I was feeling, and then I'd post it on my Zanga. Yeah. And then people would be like, "You're a poet." And I'd be like, "No, this is just my feelings." And that's still what I say. I think it's really messed up that we live in a world that calls people being honest poetry, because what that does is it make it so that art is the only place we can be real. And that's what I think I was trying to get at, is that I think that Western culture is so deeply ritualized lying that performance can be one of the only places we actually can have to escape from that. So for me, everything that I read comes from my heart because it is my heart. It's like spilled out. So I already know how to say it because I already feel it.
Also, thank you very much for your talk. I thought it was pretty incredible. I have two questions for you. One of them relates to, you talked a lot about cis white women. Mm-hmm. And throughout your talk, I mean, that was a strong feature as a contrast to other things. Mm. I want to ask you about class, actually, sure. Because when you say cis white women, I feel like class is invisible, and I don't think all cis white women are the same. And I think it masks, and I'm not saying you're doing this, I'm saying this is one of the weaknesses of language, I guess, is that what is concealed in that speaking is the complexity of the structures of society and what it takes to actually change the world. Which is my second question, which is, what I really liked about your speaking is the criticism, the critique of gender, which is a position I share. And sometimes I feel like the conversation about transgender and gender unwittingly results in further ingraining gender and gender stereotypes, but your speaking really didn't do that. But what I'm left with is what's next. What does it take to actually change that? So that was two things. One about class, and the not homogenising cis white women, and the second piece is what does it take to change the world?
Totally. Well,
in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your questions. I appreciate them. To the first question about class, I think you're totally right. I think what's especially interesting about gender is when you look at the history of gender, only certain classes were given permission to be read as beautiful women, even within white culture, right? And that a lot of that had to do with consumption in a capitalist economy. So, oh, you're wearing this beautiful dress versus you have to wear a type of uniform as a worker that kind of degenders you in a way, right? So I think class is totally at play here, but I think the type of discourse that I'm trying to conjure is that regardless of class, a narrative of white cis womanhood was circulated across the British Empire to justify colonization, right? And I think there's a difference between the reality of people's experiences and the representation of how how governments and state policy implement them. And this is why I actually think that white working class cisgender women have a stake in the liberation of trans people, because in a lot of ways they become trans by being unable to fit into that representation of rich white cis womanhood that they get circulated into, right? So when I'm saying the narrative or the discourse or the idea or the paradigm of white cisgender womanhood, what I mean is literally things like the reason that white women often were not allowed to go to India was because the climate was so hot that they might have sexual proclivities, right? And there's this narrative there that like, oh, white cis women cannot have sexual proclivities, and a fear there that white cis women could actually desire non-white men, right? And so there's this continual discourse that gets created about white cis womanhood that actually has seeped into our feminism without a history. And that's why I get so mad at cisgender feminism. Like, do you know the history of this discourse? The history of this discourse of rooting your entire political imagination on the basis of your vagina actually has to do with a conservative state policy that only understands women as reproductive vehicles to produce new settlers and new people to build a nation. And that actually for you to say that my body belongs to me is an anti-colonial move, because your body is not allowed to belong to you by a state that requires you to produce children to colonize and settle other places, right? So I think that's what the sort of idea that I'm trying to relate to around white cis womanhood. But I think what I would add is that the way that I understand transness is not actually those of us who are gender variant, but those of us who are class variant, those of us who are racially variant, those of us who are migrants, because the truth is the gender binary is upheld by white, able-bodied, cisgender, upper-class norms, and those of us who don't align with those types of identities get disenfranchised. But I think trans people are some of the only people who have had the audacity to say that's what's happening. I think in a lot of other communities there's still this deep and perpetual love and reliance to these tropes, whereas trans people, because of the violence that we experience is so explicit, we've learned like, okay, this is not working, like, let's start over. About changing the world. So I actually want to push back on the way that you phrase that question, because I think that there's this trans-misogynist thing that happens where we blame trans people for upholding gender. And that essentially looks like that we blame binary, medicalized trans women for not being liberationists because they've bought into the patriarchy and feel like they have to modify their body. That has a lot of tones of a sort of trans-exclusionary radical feminist that says that trans women can only be permissible in feminism if they're good feminists and good with their bodies versus just like being women. Like there has to be this expectation there, because last time I checked, cisgender women are not upheld to a standard of being feminist in order to have your gender be recognized or affirmed, right? And that it's totally possible for all of us, regardless of our genders, to endure and internalize patriarchy, but that shouldn't disqualify us from our identities. And I'm less interested in blaming trans people for upholding gender, and more interested, and I think what I was trying to get to in my speech, of critiquing a culture that requires us to participate in gender in order to be safe, right? The majority of trans people who medically transition or who speak about gender in ways as if it's real are not doing so because they intrinsically and fundamentally believe this, but because they know that if they don't, they could die. They literally are making decisions where if I do not pass in this particular way, every single day of my life, people are going to have scrutiny of me, and I'll either want to kill myself or someone will want to kill me. So I think it's really reductive to blame trans people who are navigating a world where every single part of their body is scrutinized for having to participate in patriarchy. And it's the same sort of misogynist logic that blames feminine cisgender women for buying into the patriarchy. And the undertones there is that the only way to be gender neutral or to escape from gender is to be masculine. And I'm so bored of that conversation, because femininity can be gender neutral. It's a misogynist equation that sees ending gender as ending femininity. I'm interested in ending gender policing and not interested in ending femininity. In terms of what we do going forward, what I would ask is for us to understand that we will never have liberation of women, of trans people, of feminists, unless we have indigenous sovereignty. Like I began this sort of speech saying, like, it's just like, unless we have like the end of anti-Black police violence in my country, unless we have the end of like draconian and horrific refugee and migrant policies, like these are some of the most pressing issues of our time that somehow are not elevated as gender issues. But the gender binary is the same system that creates borders between countries. It's the same system that creates this idea of foreigner. All these binaries are intersectional, right? And so I think there's this thing that happens where trans people of color like me are congratulated for being intersectional. We're like, wow, like you fit so many different things. And what I just want to remind people is that you're deeply intersectional too. It's just that your whiteness gets invisibilized, your cisness gets invisibilized. And I want you to think about how your intersectional identity makes you pursue a political agenda that only enfranchises yourself. And that actually, if you were really, I mean, I fundamentally believe that the things that have the capacity to transform and liberate us are the things that we've been taught to destroy and fear. So I think that the things that give us the most anxiety in the feminist movement are often the things that could actually liberate us. Like, we have to actually get a little uncomfortable and actually not just show up like for other issues, but understand that the liberation of these people, Aboriginal people, Indigenous people, Black people, trans feminine people, sex workers, people with disabilities, etc., means the liberation of everyone else, right? It's not from a place of like, I hate discourses of allyship or showing up or whatever, because what that does is it makes it so the only reason that you should show up is because you have some weird paternalistic desire to like uplift someone versus a deep and sincere political analysis that without that liberation, you will never be free. And I think there is no better testament than the cisgender feminist movement. Right now, we're in an anti-abortion moment in my country where there's a long, long, long list of policies that are trying to effectively criminalize cisgender women, trans men, non-binary people from getting access to abortions, right? And the discourse that's being produced around this is very much still a very vaginic-centric sort of narrative of like, my right to my vagina, here's my vagina thing. And I just want to shake everyone and be like, this is what the state actually wants you to do. They actually want you to only engage in the terms of genitalia versus push a more substantive politic of misogyny. And the truth is, misogyny is what's at the core here, because one of the things that heteropatriarchal colonialism did was teach us to devalue and degrade femininity. And what we should be fighting for in all of our feminist movements is not just the right for women to have rights, but rather the right for femininity to be liberated itself, which is a much more ambitious political agenda that I actually think a lot of cisgender feminists are not interested in. Because the other thing that trans politics allows us to do is to give us a language to talk about masculinity outside of cisgender men. And that's something I think we really need to be talking about more. The reason that trans feminine people like me are systematically denied and erased from the feminist movement is because you still see us as men, whereas you do not see the trans men and butch women in your spaces as masculine, because you still reduce us to our genitalia. So there's still this colonial equation that happens where we actually are once again kicking out the very people who have the theory, the politics, and the lived experience to actually create a liberatory feminist politic are kicked out because are really simplistic ideas of what our genders are. And I should also add that what's really also frustrating about the current political discourse, and I think what I'm trying to do in this answer is also shift responsibility from trans people towards the feminist movement, because I'm really tired of this paradigm that's set up where trans people get invited to the feminist movement and have to be good trans to be accepted, versus the feminist movement having to realize that it has to restructure, re-architecture its entire self to be worthy of my presence. Because I'm not interested in being here if we're just gonna sit around and do some basic colonial politics. It's not interesting to me. So what's more interesting to me is if we can actually create a bigger narrative of what gender self-determination looks like. That's what I think we need to shift our rhetoric towards, is gender self-determination. And that mandate is so large, because how can people in prison determine their genders when they have uniforms? How can people in refugee camps determine their genders when they're put in detention centers, right? How can people who are poor, how can people who are homeless determine their genders? What it would look like to create a world where every single person could say, this is who I am, and not only be able to say that, but be able to articulate and express that, and not only be able to articulate and express that, but not experience violence because of that, and not only experience violence for that, but be encouraged for that, would involve the complete destruction of the world as it is now, and a recreation of a world that is new and possible, right? So what I often offer is shifting our language away from women's rights or even like feminism to really talking about gender self-determination, which I think holds so many of our experiences and understands that gender is part of other big movements of self-determination of land, self-determination of property, self-determination of worth.
Just going to take one more question.
Hi, thank you, Alok, again. I think I saw you perform at Colour Tongues the other night, and it was just amazing. I was so emotionally, can't even put it into words. So yeah, thank you. I think I struggled to come up with a question at first because you've just given me so much to think about. But as a trans feminine person who finds a lot of comfort and assertion in writing and performing, I'm interested to know what brought you to this platform, and also what are the most gratifying aspects of your writing and performance for you personally?
Sure, thank you. I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm like, here I am, 25 years old, like performing, and I'm like, how did this happen? Like, did I actually consent to doing this? And then I'm here to tell you guys and you all that I did not. I had to perform because that was the only place in my life I was allowed to be honest about being depressed and suicidal growing up in the town that I did. I had to perform because it was the only place in my life I could wear a costume and then actually experience something real. And so now here I am on the other side of that, feeling all like accomplished, but I'm like, actually, this is really tragic that I don't actually know what I would have been or what I would have been interested in if I didn't have to go to performance in order to survive. So I have a conflicted relationship with performance because it's like wonderful, it's cute, I can like talk about how liberating it is, but I didn't consent to it. And that's why I really reject this idea that we need to have like some sort of like artistic training or like some sort of like background in art, because actually like for me, I had to learn how to be an artist because I literally was cast as a cisgender man from the minute I was born. I had to perform that role, darling. And that was a very difficult role, as you might imagine. And then I had to cast the role of trying to be trans. That was a difficult role. And then I had to cast the role of trying to be a woman. That was an even more difficult role. And then at some point you just realize I'm really good at acting and performing because I've had to be. So in terms of like what I get from it, I think that it's often the things that we develop as survival mechanisms that we learn to actually find happiness and joy from because we have to. So because performance was a survival method for me, initially it was just more like, oh great, gonna go traumatize myself in front of hundreds of people, woo, awesome. But then now I think that the thing that I enjoy the most about performance it's less about the thing that it does for my body and more about the potential to create a space for people to cry. That's literally, I no longer have sort of like, my art is revolutionary, my art is going to change the world. I'm like, okay, that's a large mandate. I don't know, my art is my art. But my art, what I can promise you, is going to give you an invitation to weep. And not just cry, but to weep and to be destroyed. Because the truth is, like, I really believe that we need to be talking more about mental health outside of the language of just like mental health, because that's even just such a, we need to be talking about depression, and we need to be talking about depression is actually something that all of us have, not just something that people who are medicalized have it. We need to be talking about how oppression actually is somatic, and that actually the same neurological pathways that process physical pain are the ones that process emotional pain. So that those of us who grow up as emotionally stigmatized identities never get over our trauma and are told over and over again by white medical discourse that we have to overcome our trauma. I don't think it's possible to overcome trauma when trauma becomes us, because what you're asking me to do is to kill myself. That's the only way to overcome trauma, when it's part of you. So what I try to do in my performance is to create a space to create a different relationship with people's trauma. That's like, hey, actually, I see your trauma and it's fucking awesome. And like, I see your trauma and it's fucking beautiful because I understand that you're broken like me, and I don't require you to be fixed or coherent or perfect or wonderful or articulate or feminist to be worthy of that love and respect. And that's what I want to do in my performance now. It's less about the art and more about the therapy. And the truth is, art is the only way to actually get real therapy anymore. So that's where we're at.